Africa Climate Podcast.
Hello, I hope you're doing well. Thank you so much for joining us for another episode of the Africa Climate Podcast. I sincerely appreciate your support. This podcast would not have come this far without you, so thank you. In my motherland, Kenya, we say Asante Sana. This podcast is dedicated to bridging the climate reporting gaps in Africa. I'm your host, Sophie Mbogwa. Now, have you had a chance to listen to Africa Climate News YouTube yet? Now, this week we are talking to Kenyan farmers. These farmers have been receiving text messages from the Kenya Met on how the weather is expected to change. So I talked to them to understand how this has impacted their farming. Since traditional weather forecasting has really been made unreliable by the changing climate, and as you know, the Horn of Africa right now is experiencing the worst drought. Also on our website, you'll find a story by Temwa from Malawi on economic losses and psychological damages the tropical storm Anna has brought to the communities amid no money for their recovery. Now let us shift gear to climate change and migration in Eastern Horn of Africa. And today I'm excited to be joined by a lady guest. Finally, this podcast host has not been doing an excellent job regarding gender balancing. We'll see how this changes. But anyway, Lisa, thank you so much for joining me today and from the International Organization for Migration to talk about the climate-induced migration. Lisa, would you please introduce yourself to our audiences?
So my name is Lisa Lim Akem. I'm actually from Mauritius. I work at IOM's regional office covering the East Horn of Africa and Southern Africa sub-regions. I'm the regional migration, environment, and climate change thematic specialist.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. It's such a pleasure speaking to you today. And I just would want you to start, when we talk about human mobility and migration issues, basically you find that people move and people have always moved from time immemorial. Just give us a brief history of human mobility, specifically in the Horn of Africa.
I think, as you say, people have always moved. And I think as a continent, mobility has really played a key feature in the way that people live. So people have always, for example, moved to fertile areas like watersheds, for agriculture. And at the same time, people have always moved away from arid and semi-arid areas. But I think the most typical type of movement that we've seen, which I would say is very traditional for this region and has been for probably centuries, is pastoralism. Pastoralists are probably the oldest mobile population, and they use movement to make an area or a type of land, which is the arid and semi-arid lands, to make it productive. I think it's one of the only sectors that makes so much productive use of that type of land. So it's it just basically shows you how normal it is for people to move in Africa and in this region.
And so when we speak about migration, basically in the traditional aspect of it, to us, it is something that helps people grow resilient. But now when we're talking about climate and human mobility, we're seeing a situation where people are being forced to move. Or am I getting it wrong?
No, you're right. I think traditionally people have always moved based on reliable weather patterns. So they've always known where it will rain, where there'll be pasture, where there'll be water. They've always known when riverbanks will flood and silt will be laid out, which will, really help agriculture. But then with climate change, what's happening is that these weather patterns have become completely unreliable. And for example, when it rains, it is extremely heavy, much heavier than it's ever been, and for very short, intense periods. So then, what happens is then landslides occur, flash floods occur, water runs off and doesn't get time to be absorbed, into water pans or underground. So climate change is creating this level of unpredictability which forces people to move. So, in years gone by, we knew, for example, that there would be drought periods, maybe once every 5 years. And now we're seeing the fifth consecutive failed rainy season, which is, completely unusual. So how can people recover from a drought? So all the coping mechanisms that were used before, now with the impact of climate change, are no longer becoming useful. And people find themselves in a cycle of never really quite being able to recover. The impacts of climate change on people are so different. And this is where we use that term climate change as a threat multiplier. And this term I find quite useful in helping us understand this very complex and kind of dynamic challenge. And it means that whatever threats existed before, so high levels of unemployment or high levels of vulnerability of women and female-headed households, these threats are now going to be magnified. They're going to be increased. They're going to be compounded by the different climate change events. So certainly, like communities that were previously marginalized, who didn't have access to water or healthcare or other services, will have even greater challenges because of drought, and which will now, further reduce the few sources of water that they had before, or floods, which may now increase their needs for health services that they didn't have access to anyway. Climate change is so unpredictable now, and it's difficult to know a location that has, never had flash floods before suddenly does.
Some time back, I did a series actually was looking into mental health issues and climate change. And one of the things that actually was coming out from that episode with the communities that I actually visited is the fact that, communities are not able, they're not able to actually cope, because just before you can go back to life and normal life, a drought has happened. Just before you can deal with the effects of the drought, a flooding has happened. And that's what we are actually seeing. When I speak to scientists, they keep saying that the Western Indian Ocean is actually warming fastest than any part of the tropical ocean. And you find that now that sends mixed kind of signals in terms of flooding, storms and drought alternating within now the Horn of Africa countries. And I'm wondering, in terms of when it comes to like the region, you find majority of these people are pastoralists. They've traveled for years, for over a long time. They knew how to cope. They looked at the weather in terms of understanding, and they had grazing patterns by which they knew at this time of the season we move to this particular area or this particular country, and that's how we grew resilient, or that's how they survive. Wondering in terms of a strategy that can improve livelihood, because sometimes you also find that migration can become a development enabler. I'm wondering a strategy to improve sustainable livelihoods and help these communities adapt from these pressures, environmental pressures and climate change.
Yeah, that's a really big question. You touched upon psychological well-being. You touched upon people being unable to recover before, another disaster occurs. And you talked about pastoralists and the challenges they face. And if we look specifically at pastoralists, there are so many different impacts that come from different directions that affect their livelihoods and their well-beings. And these impacts are not always just because of climate change. We have, for example, the commercialization of pastoralism now, which puts a lot of pressure on traditional pastoralists because, they don't typically have the massive herds and maybe the manpower that some of the commercial outfits do. So then, in addition to that, you now have the issues with climate change, which now cause not only for them to change the traditional routes that they had before, and those traditional routes were routes that had been pre-agreed, I would say, with farming communities along the way. So they now have to venture into different areas where there aren't maybe any existing agreements. Then you have the issues where land is now being fenced off, preventing access to resources because they're limited or scarce. So, land being fenced off in front of, around lakes or rivers or water pans so that pastoralists can no longer access them, or farmers now having to farm closer to rivers for water access, and the pastoralists now are faced with farms that block their route. And then also changing precipitation patterns such that farming is no longer predictable. So a time when pastoralists knew there was going to be a harvest and they would bring their cattle post-harvest, is now in full harvest, and their cattle come in and and eat obviously the crops. So there are all these different challenges. And in terms of solutions, I think the important thing is that we need to understand all the different aspects that impact on a particular group. Say, if we're using pastoralists as the example, we need to understand all the different challenges that they face, not just the ones related to climate change, but also the policy ones, and their access to services, their capacity and ability to adapt, and the investment that is there to help them develop new skills. And then we need to really help facilitate their adaptive capacity. So IOM has just recently completed a report on the adaptive capacity of pastoralists in the IGAD region. It was conducted together with ICPALD, which is the pastoral livestock arm of IGAD, and a researcher. And we realized that what we need to do is to look at what adaptation exists for pastoralists, what we can support. And one of the things I think that is fantastic about IGAD is they have this new protocol on transhumance. And within that protocol, it really provides a very comprehensive level of support, not only to allow pastoralists to continue moving in safe, orderly and regular ways, but also to ensure that there is a portability of services, that they can access health services for themselves and their animals across borders. And then it also provides support for those who want to drop out of pastoralism or have dropped out of pastoralism. So it really encourages investment in different areas for people who might have dropped out, in order to allow pastoralists to have a more sedentary life if that's what they would like. It's a massive issue. It's a very comprehensive issue, and it really necessitates a very kind of coordinated and collaborative level of support.
And when you talk about this whole issue of migration, now we've seen issues of refugees that comes out of a result of conflict from a specific area to a different, but then again, maybe in between also a climate disaster happens. In terms of the larger climate talk, do we draw a line between climate migrant and other different migrations? Is it definable?
It is not really possible to clearly define what a migrant is, what a climate or environmental migrant is. It is possible to define what a refugee is, and we already have that definition.
Yeah.
But the definition of refugee does not include the people who are fleeing climate-related disasters and emergencies. And there is a lot of talk about that whole concept of, providing people with certain protections in the event that they are climate or environmental migrants. But for the very reason that you cannot define what a climate or environmental migrant is, those discussions don't really ever go anywhere, because it's just difficult. If you consider somebody who is, and now we're talking specifically about what we would call slow onset climate changes as opposed to disasters. There is a disaster like a flood, people will obviously take the life-saving option of fleeing. Then it's very clear that this person has, fled a location because of climate change. But in the event that it's a slow onset process, like, sea level rise, where, the sea comes closer and closer to your home over a period of years, or, drought, which becomes more and more intense or, repeated over years, which is not really anticipated. In those contexts, some people will move because they have the networks, or they have the resources to move, or they have just the willingness to move, or their community's moving, or whatever. And others, everyone else is moving, but they don't want to move, or they cannot afford to move, or they don't have networks that would make them feel safe to move somewhere else. So essentially there are so many different types of movement. There are some movements that are really useful. So for example, short-term movements and we see a lot of this in our region, from rural to urban or peri-urban areas. We call this rural urban migration. But then, these movements may or may not be related directly to climate change. And a lot of the time it's really related to for economic reasons because of climate change. So the indirect link, I would say, between climate change and mobility is what makes it very difficult to define what an environmental or climate migrant is.
And that's very interesting because the reason why I asked you, because when you understand what's happening in Somalia as we speak right now, nearly half of that of the country population are facing historical level of drought. Just the other day, we saw over 1 million people, and these are mostly women and children, have been displaced. And it's that whole thing with thinking COP27 is actually at the blink, it's just almost happening, taking place. And you wonder, this is a real crisis. And you think about the economy, development trajectory of Somalia. And this means that when these climate disasters happen, if the country had a development plan, money that is specifically meant to build these people hospitals, money that is meant to build roads, is diverted now to this crisis to make sure that these people can actually afford a meal. And it's that thinking of like the economic impact. When you listen to, follow up internationally, the push and pull that has always been in terms of finance, and now we've moved something that I envisage will be a push and pull for a long time in terms of loss and damage and all that. How do we sustainably deal with these issues as temperatures keep rising and impacting these communities? And so they have to always be forced to move, and their social fabric and the economic fabric is devastated, as well as that of their country.
Yeah, I mean, this is something that has been discussed, at length within the SDGs. We talk about climate change reversing developmental gains, and we see essentially not just even reversing developmental gains, but preventing altogether, any type of developmental gain, because the amount of funding required to respond to disasters is just overwhelming. So, when you talk about sustainability, for me, the word that always comes up is prevention and preparedness. And unfortunately, it's not as fancy. It's not as a sexy topic as disasters and emergency response, humanitarian response. I'm sure you know yourself already from the media that, news about humanitarian response or disasters is far more interesting and appealing to audiences than news about prevention, about building resilience and that sort of thing. So, but at the end of the day, that's what needs to be done. Disasters don't affect us all in the same way. I come from Mauritius, and in Mauritius, we have cyclones every single year. Big ones, small ones, devastating ones, but we have learned to build for them. We have learned to prepare for them. Every year before cyclone season, the government goes around cutting down all the big trees that are blocking the roads or blocking power lines. We have a very good early warning system, and etc. And cyclones typically don't cause any deaths ever. Whereas, a cyclone in a different country that does not have that same level of preparedness will, absolutely devastate the population. So there is a level of preparedness and resilience building that allows people to adapt to these disasters and allows people to continue to live productively and safely within these environments. But then we also have to be very cognizant of the fact that with global warming still on track, and really we see the intensification of these hazards year in, year out. There will be some locations where people just will not be able to live anymore, and that's I think a reality. So I think in IOM at least we recognize that adaptation has its limits, and that's why we would say that migration is also an adaptation strategy, in that sometimes you just have to migrate out and you will not be able to go back. And a key example is, sea level rise, when your home has basically been taken by the sea. There is no other option but to be relocated elsewhere.
And now moving on to COP27. I know in July, heads of states and ministers from Eastern Horn of Africa met in Kampala and to raise awareness on climate change and environmental degradation, how it's impacting human mobility. Can we talk about what the Kampala Declaration is all about and what came out of that?
Yeah, thanks for asking this question, because this is truly, for me, a very exciting moment and a time when we're really seeing this topic of human mobility in the context of climate change taking on a priority in the states of this region. So all the states that came to Kampala clearly prioritize human mobility in the context of climate change, and their level of understanding of this topic was very high. The way that they articulated the issues was very clear. What I would want to acknowledge is that it was, I think, the first time that so many high-level delegates from, I think, 16 African member states, and that included 2 heads of states from Uganda and South Sudan. It was the first time all of these people at this very high level came together to develop, to discuss and to develop a joint approach on this topic of migration, environment, and climate change. That in itself was very significant. And like I said, it really drives home to us how much this topic is at the forefront of the priorities of the states in this region and on this continent, despite all the other overwhelming priorities that they might have. So during this, it was a 3-day conference, and during this conference, which was hosted and led by the government of Uganda, all of the 16 member states delivered messages about the challenges they face in relation to climate change as a driver of migration, but also the opportunities they see for leveraging on migration in their countries and in the region. We had representatives from 3 different ministries, the Ministry of Environment, Foreign Affairs, and Interior. So the sharing of experiences was really comprehensive. It was cross-cutting, and they addressed many different sectors. And what we did is we had also invited youth representatives from 12 different countries, and they shared their challenges, their hopes, their ideas, their priorities with the audience, and they interacted directly with the policymakers. We also had representatives from civil society who made their address to the policymakers, and they shared their perspectives from the communities they work with. So what was great was that all of these very important contributions were captured in this first ministerial, high-level ministerial declaration on migration, environment, and climate change, which was signed on the 29th of July. So this is called the Kampala Ministerial Declaration on Migration and Environment and Climate Change, and not to be confused with the 2009 Kampala Declaration, which is on IDPs. And this is a very concrete output of the conference. And for me, it heralds the importance of this topic for our region and for the continent. And this is the first ever document of its kind. And even though it's non-binding, it's a very informative document because it clearly lists the priorities of the region. And it's a very strong basis from which policymakers and practitioners can build a stronger and more coherent response to addressing all these challenges. What was very clear, I think, was that the signatory states strongly communicated their own commitments to addressing the challenges. They put down 12 different points, which included things like enacting urgent regional and national legislation, policies and strategies, developing comprehensive urban plans to address population surges, creating and increasing investment in the circular economy. And then the declaration also makes 5 requests of the parties to the UNFCCC, like scaling up climate finance and to support capacity building, technology transfer. But I think for me, one of the key reasons I really appreciate this Kampala Declaration is that it promotes what I feel is a truly collaborative approach in dealing with this topic. Right from the very first sentence, it states, we, the ministers of environment, ministers of interior, ministers of foreign affairs, of the governments of the members of the Intergovernmental Authority on Development, IGAD, and the East African Community, EAC, and the states of the Eastern Horn of Africa, having gathered together with high-level representatives of the African Union, UN, and development partners and the youth. I mean, how, amazing is that to show this broad collaborative approach? And then the very first line of the preamble states, in the spirit of regional integration and friendship that ties the countries of the East and Horn of Africa region. And then under the commitments, it states how the different ministers and ministries, the EAC, IGAD, the states, have gathered key messages and experience from experts, from youth, from community leaders, from development partners in the spirit of international cooperation and regional integration. So this declaration, in my opinion, drives forward not only an important topic, but also an important way of addressing it. As exciting as it is, we have not rested, and we still have a long way to go now because we need to bring the declaration to the attention of the parties of the UNFCCC and the different negotiating groups so that the topic of human mobility in the context of climate change becomes part of the COP negotiations and the COP discussions. And the slogan, I think, that we used during the Kampala Declaration was, we can no longer talk about climate change without talking about human mobility. And I think that's the main message.
Lisa, thank you so much. I sincerely appreciate you taking time speaking to us about human mobility and climate change. What is your final word as we head towards the COP27?
I don't really have a final word per se. I just feel that there needs to be a lot more focus and responsibility when it comes to world leaders negotiating at COP27. A lot more focus on how climate change is impacting on the most vulnerable states. And those are not the ones in the global north, but the ones in the global south. And we hear the same message again and again. The global south is not responsible for climate change, but yet they are the ones most affected by it. And this is the reality. And yet I feel that there is a certain level of not wanting to hear that message. So I think that when more responsibility is accepted by the global north to support the people who really, most need that support, that's when we'll start to see really concerted change. We'll start to see more financing, more technology, and etc. All these things will follow suit. And this is when, we will actually be able to have a sustainable, a lasting impact on our continent.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Lisa. I appreciate and do hope to keep speaking to you on migration issues and to hopefully set COP27 how it takes shapes.
Thank you so much for taking your time and for your interest in the topic.
Thank you.
Bye, Sophie.
That was Lisa Lim Akem, the IOM East and the Horn of Africa Migration, Environment and Climate Change thematic specialist, talking to us there about climate-induced migration in the East and Horn of Africa countries. In the meantime, please subscribe to the Africa Climate Podcast on iTunes, Spotify, Google Podcasts, Podcast Addict, and every other channel you access your other podcast from, as well as our website, www.africaclimatechangenews.com. Also, please do subscribe to our Africa Climate News YouTube channel and follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. I will talk to you soon. Kwaheri for now. My name is Sophie Mbogwa.
Africa Climate Podcast.